All right, Rabbosai, good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Maseches Eruvin. Such an incredible Shechianu v'kimanu v'gianu lazman hazeh to begin another Masechta, and an incredible one. I mean, they're all incredible Masechtas. So we begin by thanking our sponsors for the Shir, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Av, Avram and Shendi Kelman, with the hope and tefillah that this month of Av will be a Yom Tov, filled with joy in the eternal Beis HaMikdash. Week of learning sponsors Howard and Aileen Friedman in memory of Howard's mother, Tilla Bas Chaim Zichron Livracha. Our Day of Learning sponsor, Alan and Sherry Steinmetz, commemorating the yahrzeit of Alan's grandfather, Mr. Sam Steinmetz, Reb Shimon ben Reb Yitzchak Isaac. Our Daf Yomi sponsor, Mark and Elsa Lustman, in memory of Mark's mother, Ann Lustman, Chana Rachel Bas Avram Alter. Another Daf Yomi sponsor, Michael Leichter, in honor of his wife Rivki, passing her nurse practitioner boards. Mazel Tov. May you continue to be successful in all your endeavors. Hard work always pays off in life, and you have proven that it holds true even today. Truly beautiful. And our first parak of Maseches Eruvin is dedicated by Jeff and Shari Venick and Stephen and Holly Venick in memory of their father Herman Venick, Zichron Livracha. Chano Yisrael ben Ruvain, Zichron Livracha. Herman was a beloved husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, longtime pillar of our Kehillah. May our collective learning serve as an aliyah for his neshama. We thank all of our sponsors for their incredible dedication and generosity. And I will say with that, let us begin Maseches Eruvin. So I will say, here we go. So the Mishnah begins, Mavoi. So we'll say just a word of background. And actually, we'll say is you're going to see one of the great things that we are going to experience is the amount of overlap between Shabbos and between Eruvin. So many of the different sugyas that we saw in Shabbos are going to come up in Eruvin. And the truth is, I say it differently. So many of the things that were brought up in Shabbos weren't really Shabbos in Yanim. They were much more Eruvin in Yanim, but were brought up in passing in Shabbos. So here we're going to expound on a lot of those things mentioned. And Emir Tzashem, so a lot of it will be familiar. A lot of it new, will say Emir Tzashem. But one of the things I will say is Mavoi. So remember again, very quickly, we've spoken about this many, many times. So in understanding the way that Talmudic communities, or really neighborhoods, were set up, is that you had homes. Homes opened up into a joint chutzner, a joint courtyard. Then what would happen? Joint courtyards would open up into a mavui, an alleyway. Alleyways would then open up into a Reshus Harabim, a public domain. So we are going to begin by discussions regarding a mavui. So we'll say, so remember again, midda oraisa, on a biblical level, a mavui is not a Reshus Harabim. And therefore, again, technically speaking, there should be no problem carrying anywhere in a mavui. You can understand why Chazal were nervous about a mavui. Because a mavui, although it is halachically not a Reshus Harabim, looks like a Reshus Harabim because you have a lot of different people, remember again, from many different chatzeros, using that common alleyway. So because that Chazal felt you had to put some type of reminder, some type of siman in that mavui, remember again, so what's the issue? If people carry in an unrestricted fashion in a mavui, the concern is that line of demarcation between the mavui and the Reshus Harabim is often blurred. In other words, you would walk out of the mavui into Reshus Harabim without really even giving it much of a second thought. In order to avoid accidental carrying from a mavui into a Reshus Harabim, so Chazal instituted a heker, some type of reminder, a demarcation to show that a mavui is one space, a Reshus Harabim is another space. So that's the concept we begin with. So here we go. So mavui shu gavah l'malam me'esrim amos. So if you have a mavui that is taller than 20 amos. So we'll say, now what does that mean? So Rashi already points out over here, this is a very important Rashi. Rashi means, Mavui shu gavoa shenichu es hakora. So also we're going to see that there are two ways in which you can go ahead and allow for carrying inside of a Mavui. So just to understand, the rabbi stepped in and said, you cannot carry within a Mavui unless, of course, you do something to that Mavui. What do you have to do to the Mavui? You have to put what's called either a lechi or a korah. A korah means a beam across the top of the mavui, or a lechi, a beam down the side of the mavui. Again, we'll discuss the dimensions of those beams. We'll even discuss what those beams do. It's not immediately clear what purpose exactly those beams serve. But so we'll see. So now, when we say that a mavui is taller than 20 amos, What it means is if you placed the korah. So in our particular case over here, you have a mavui, you want to be able to carry in the mavui. So we're working a little bit backwards, I will say. We are assuming that the way that you carry in a mavui is you put a korah across the top, a board, a beam across the entrance, so you have the mavui. Why that works, how that works, we have no idea. We're just presupposing it works. So now what happens if that beam is lamala from more than 20 amas high. So now go back to Rashi. So mavoi shehi gavoa shenichu esakor lamala me'esr ma'ama v'kor zu lahatir l'talta l'socha ba. The point of this korah, the point of this beam across the top of the mavoi is to permit carrying inside of the mavoi. Dimid da'oraisa itzar hotzaz Rosh Hashanah b'Shabbos u'mahi Rosh Hashanah srachu plache gidola. So I say because midaraisa, you can't carry Dalet Amas in a Rosh Hashanah, public domain. And I will say we have a very specific definition. What is a public domain? Rashi says Srachio Placha. So what's Srachio are plazas, large open areas. Kedarmina Meherik Yitzios HaShabbos, we're already quoting Shabbos. Shedomun Ledigle Midbar, the Chomile de Shabbos Mishkan Garminon. Va'agalo Shalavim Berochav Tes Zayin Ama Ozli Kedarminim Ba'azorek. Hilchach lo havi Rosh Hashanah b'tzir miyudvav ama rochav u'mafulosh mibeis Russian. So let's listen to this. We know this from Shabbos. What is the halachic definition of a Rosh Hashanah? Halachic definition, 3 criteria. At least 16 amos wide, open on both ends, and has pedestrian traffic of at least 600,000 people. That is the definition of Rosh Hashanah. Where does that come from? It's very simple. It comes from the Jewish encampment in the desert, right? When the Levitic wagons traveled side by side, there was a width of 16 amos. The midbar, the desert, obviously is open on both sides, and there were 600,000 men plus, 600,000 plus, between the ages of 20 and 60. That is the definition of a Rosh Hashanah. If you do not conform to that definition, you might want to be a Rosh Hashanah, you might look like a Rosh Hashanah, but you're not a Rosh Hashanah. So now watch this. Aval mavui katzerhu ve'ina rachav yudavavama. A mavui, of course, is much smaller, much more narrow. It's not open. Right, it's not 16 amas wide. V'nami rachav hu ena mafulosh ala Rosh Echad pasol shram Rosh Echad sasum. And I will say more often than not, a mavui, an alleyway was not open on both sides. An alleyway was only open on one side, so it's also not what we call mafulash, open. And furthermore, the Gemara says, fine. We'll discuss about a mavoi mafulosh, about a mavoi open on both sides, what you do with that. And therefore, we'll say, this is a very important Rashi. So because it's not a Rosh Hashanah, because a mavui is not the Rosh Hashanah, technically speaking, midda araisa, you are permitted to go ahead and carry inside of it, below shum tikun, without doing anything to it. However, the Rabbanan gazer alei mishum da'asi le'echluf Rosh Hashanah. The rabbis, on the other hand, were concerned. What were they concerned about? That you are going to confuse a mavui with a Rosh Hashanah. That you're going to confuse the two. And because you're going to confuse the two, therefore, again, the rabbi stepped in and said, they're concerned if we allow you to carry Rosh Hashanah in a mavui, you're going to come to carry Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, Vishayua b'takanta delechi okora, delehavi hakera, delolesi lemishri Rosh Hashanah gemura. Therefore, the rabbi said, even though a mavui is not Rosh Hashanah, as you just said, but say you could see how people may come to confuse the two, because also in a mavui, you have a lot of different people from a lot of different areas converging on a same space. Therefore, the rabbi said, we don't want you to confuse a mavui with Sarabim, and therefore, in order to carry a mavui, you need a heker. Rabbi say, now again, we're not going to get too hung up on how Rashi defines a lechi or a korah over here, because we're going to see how a lechi or a korah actually works is subject to a fundamental machlokes. But for now, Rashi just says, therefore, the rabbi said, you want to carry the mavui, no problem. All you need is a lechi or a korah, a beam across the top or a beam down the side. As long as you have that, you are good to go. I will say, I was going to point out, how much hakaras do we have to have to Rashi? How much you have to hakaras to, because a Rashi, like, we'll say, how would you learn this Mishnah without a Rashi like that? Right, that Rashi just said at the table. In fact, sure all of you heard, this past Erev Shabbos, Rabbi Steinsaltz, Zichron Livracha, Zichron Livracha passed away. And I saw in one of the Hespedim, they said that no one since Rashi, has written an exhaustive parish on the entire Shas. On the entire Shas since Rabbi Steinsaltz. So can you imagine that those are the words of your Hesped? Can you imagine that they mention you and Rashi in the same sentence. No one since Rashi. Even sometimes you have to take a step back. Sometimes we take people for granted. We all take people for granted, and I think we end up often taking Rashi very much for granted because we assume he's always here. Because he's always here. You open up the Gemara, he's always on the side of the page. He's very reliable. He always shows up. He's always on the Chumash. He's always here. But you have to have, I can't take for granted even the people who are always there. So says the Mishnah. So therefore what happens if you have the Korah, right? If you have the beam across the top, that is too high. So halacha l'maisa, what do? So you have to bring it down within 20 amas. So we'll say, so that Rashi is an incredibly yesodistic Rashi, just set the table for everything. So now if you have a Korah that is too high, what do you need to do? You need to lower it. Now we'll say, we'll discuss why exactly the Korah has to be within 20 amas. But in any event, if it's too high, bring it down. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Enun Tzarich. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you don't have to lower the Korah. You should say again, when we speak about Yemait lowering the Mavui, we're talking about lowering the beam across the top. So if the beam is more than 20 amos high, you need to bring it down. Rabbi Yehuda says you don't have to. V'arochav me'esra amos Yemait. We'll say in the next case. What happens if the opening of the Mavui ultimately is more than 10 amos? So if the opening is more than 10 amos, you must go ahead and diminish the opening. Rashi says, "V'arachav me'esra amos yimait, dezeu shir rochav stam psachim, utfei mehachi lo mikru pesach ela pirtza." This is incredibly important. We assume that a doorway is up to 10 amos in width. We're talking about width now. So doors of 10 amos. More than 10 amos is no longer called a doorway. More than 10 amos is called a breach. And the problem is, if you want to be able to carry within a mavui, even with a lechi or a korah, ultimately, again, you must have an opening, not a breach. So therefore, again, if the opening to the mavui is within 10 amos, you're good to go. Lechi or korah can take care of everything. If it's more than 10 amos, ultimately, again, you have to go ahead and make it smaller. Now, how you would go ahead and make it smaller, so Rashi says over here, "V'tzarich linotz kanim lemait rochav knisasa ulahamida al esra pach." So we'll say, this is a very easy way, if you can imagine. Let's say you have an opening that is more than 10 amos. How do you make it less than 10 amos? So all you need to do is really put small beams inside of it that are less than 3 tefachim apart. And then by utilizing the concept of lavud, you could create walls on each side to essentially wall in the extra area. Again, we'll see that in the Gemara. How you do it is not really important right now. The point is that the Mishnah is giving us parameters for a mavui. So if you want your korah to go ahead and permit carrying inside of the mavui, it must be within 20 amos. This is according to Tanna Kama. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. An opening of the mavui must be within 10 amos. If it's more than 10 amos, you have to figure out a way to fill in the rest of that area, because within 10 amos is an opening, is a pesach. More than 10 amos is a pirtza. Pesach versus pirtza. But I will say this is going to be one of the most important yesodos in Hilchos Eruvin in general. But if you have an opening that is more than 10 amos, but it has a tzuras haPesach, what does a tzuras haPesach means? Essentially a doorway. What is a doorway? 2 side beams, 2 side posts, and an overhead post. Literally a tzuras haPesach. So we'll say, so if it has a tzuras haPesach, then what? Afapi shurachav me'esra amos ein tzarich lemait. So we'll say, if it has a tzuras haPesach, once you have a tzuras haPesach, once you have 2 side beams, right, essentially 2 lechis and the korah, 2 side posts and a beam across the top, that makes it into a doorway. Once it's a formal doorway, in other words, once it's framed as a doorway, even if it's larger or wider than 10 amos, it's still fine. That's called a doorway. So we'll say, so very important yisodos. So again, so let's just review what we have. So we have over here is Machlokas Tanakama Rabbi Yehuda. Does the korah, does the beam across the top of the mavui, does it have to be within 20 amos? Not within 20 amos. Tanakama says yes, must be within 20. If it's above 20, gotta bring it down. Rabbi Yehuda, don't worry about it. It's fine even if it's higher than 20. Next, what about the opening of the mavui? Must be within 10 amos, because more than 10 amos is a pirtza, is a breach, not a pesach. Again, if it's more than 10 amos, you could go ahead and remedy that by filling in the extra area. However, if you have an opening that is more than 10 amos, but you have a tzuras haPesach, which means, tzuras haPesach means you have a doorway, 2 side posts, 2 side beams, and an above beam, and across the top beam, halacha l'maisa, that is okay, even if it's more than 10 amos. Good. Says the Gemara, both say such a beautiful Gemara. Tanan hasam, sukkah shiga v'olam me esrim amma, psula. Also we learned, opening Mishnah Mesechus Sukkah, opening Mishnah, that if you have a sukkah that is more than 20 amas tall, it's pasul. It's pasul. Rabbi Yehuda machshir. Rabbi Yehuda holds that it is kosher. That it is kosher. So also, right, we know Rashi points out, why is a sukkah l'mala me'esrim amma? Why is a sukkah taller than 20 amas? Why is that? We'll say it's about 30 feet. Right? So why is a 30-foot tall sukkah going to be pasul? Because remember again, as Rashi points out, l'man yedu dara seichem, you have to be able to see the schach. Right? The Gemara says, "Lo shalta ba'ina." If the sukkah becomes too tall, it's just not within your ocular range. So the whole point of the sukkah is to be cognizant of the schach. If the sukkah is too tall, fine. So a sukkah that's taller than 20 amas is pasul. So the Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. So ask the Gemara, I don't understand. Ma'ishna gabe sukkah the tani psula, the gabe mavui tani takanta. So I'll say, listen to this interesting shaila. The Gemara is asking stylistically, I don't understand something. So stylistically, why is it that by sukkah, the Mishnah just says like a one-liner. If the sukkah is taller than 20 amas, pasul. Pasul, that's it. It's game over. Yet by mavui, it says, if the mavui, which again, when we see mavui taller, we mean again, what are we referring to? The korah, right? If the top beam is too tall, you might bring it down. So why is it that by sukkah, a sukkah that's the mala me'esrim, we just say pasul. No discussion, just pasul. Yet by mavoi tani takanta, the Mishnah tells us how to remedy the mavoi that's too tall. To which the Gemara says, very simple, sukkah daraisa tani psula, mavoi drabaran tani takanta. As I always say, sukkah is daraisa. So because sukkah is daraisa and its halachas are known, therefore again, if you do not conform with the already established set of halachas, it's pasul. So you both say, mavoi, the concept of a lechi and the korah, is being introduced to us over here. In other words, what the Gemara says is like this. The lashon of pasul can be used when you have an already established body of laws, and you are not in conformance with those laws, so therefore what you've produced is pasul. There's halachas of sukkah. Torah gives us the halachas of sukkah, or at least we derive from the psukim the halachas of sukkah. So if you don't conform with those halachas, pasul. You can't say pasul over here. So I can't just say pasul, because I'm going to read the Mishnah. The Mishnah is going to say, mavoi shegavol l'mala me'esrim, I'm a pasul. And what am I going to say to that? What am I going to say to that? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? What mavoi l'mala me'esrim amma? What are we talking about over here? Remember, these halachos are being introduced over here for the first time. So the lashon of pasul can only be used when you have an already agreed upon set of facts that everyone knows. You didn't conform to those facts, pasul. But lamaisa, something is being introduced for the first time over here. You can't say pasul because we don't even know what you're talking about. We're just learning about mavui, lechi, korah, everything for the first time now. Rashi says over here, mavui, the cholikara, dirabbananhu, lo shayach l'meimar by lashon paslos, shaharikan hischilu l'har oscha iske mavui v'sarosav. Umay psul, or my pasul shayach l'meimar, akati lahodiacha rabbanon shiurei bahachi. They're listening lo asa came pasul. We'll say it's an incredible idea. You can't say pasul until you know the body of law that we're talking about. So by sukkah, we know the halachas of sukkah. There's an established body of law. By mavoi, we're just being introduced over. Therefore, you can't use lashon apostle. Fine. V'baisim, what the other possibility is. V'baisim, d'oraisa nami tani takanda. Or could be not. Maybe it's not. So the first answer I will say is it's a derabanan versus a d'oraisa split. By sukkah, which is a d'oraisa, therefore already established body of halacha, we could say pasul. By mavoi, we're really being introduced to this body of law derabanan. You can't say pasul. You just can't say pasul. The other possibility is that no, maybe it's not a da'oraisa dirabanan split, but instead it's as follows: Elo sukkah dinafishin milei pasik v'tani psula, mavoi delo nefishe milei tani takanta. Well, so maybe there's a simpler distinction. Sukkah is a much more involved body of law, so therefore, again, I will say you can't start getting into how to remedy a sukkah that is too tall. Well, I'll give you a perfect example. If you have a sukkah that's l'mala me'esrim, how can you fix it? How can you fix it? Right? Lower the walls. Does that work? No. Why? Because there's a halacha by schach that says that what? Tasav lo mina asui, which means the schach has to be put onto defanos that are already fit. So technically speaking, if you have a sukkah that's too tall and you cut down the walls, that's actually not good. Oh, but it could be good. How could it be good? How could it be good? Lift up the schach and put it back up. So the point the Gemara is making over here is, can you fix a sukkah that's l'mala me'esrim amma? Absolutely. But it's a pretty detail-oriented process. So therefore, the Mishnah both can't start getting into, if you have a sukkah that's l'mala me'esrim amma, it's puzzle, but if you want to fix it, here's how you fix it. That's too much. That's too much. So what does Allah just say? L'mala me'esrim amma psula. You want to figure out how to fix it? Okay, we can have a side discussion. The great part about Mavoi, both say, is, if you have a korah, right, you have a top beam that is too high, right? So how do you fix it? How do you fix it? Just lower it. That's it. That's the end of the discussion. So because it's a very simple fix, therefore, again, the Mishnah could simply state it. So the Gemara says, so the Gemara, I'm sorry, so sukkah, which has many details, the Mishnah can't get into the remedy. Therefore, the Mishnah just says puzzle, but ultimately, again, mavui, that doesn't have a lot of details, so the Mishnah tells you how to fix the mavui that is, or the core that is too high. Amrav Yehuda Amarav, Chachamim lo lamduha, ela mipischo shel heichal. So we'll say, so now we're moving on a little bit. So now we've established ultimately the distinction between Mavui and Sukkah, and why two Mishnayos really utilize two different styles. Now I want to focus a little bit on the Machlokes. What happens if you have a Korah that is more than 20 amas high? So how does that work? So again, so remember the Tanakama says you have to bring it down within 20 amas. Rabbi Yehuda says it's fine as it is. To which the Gemara explains to Nu, what is the machlokes? What is the machlokes? So it says the Gemara, the Chachamim learned out their height requirements from the entranceway of the Heichal. Rabbi Yehuda lo lamda ela mipischo shel ulam. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, learned it out from the entranceway to the ulam. So we'll say, so just a little bit of background. You know that when you entered into the Beis HaMikdash, so remember again, the first you would enter into the Azar, to the courtyard. If you can imagine, as you keep walking east, right, you go ahead and you walk in up the steps, you walk into the ulam. The ulam was a large antechamber, the dimensions of which we're going to see in just a moment. After that, you would walk into another smaller courtyard. In that smaller courtyard, you would find the Mizbeach, and the Kabra Mizbeach, which was used for animal sacrifice. You would see the rings, right, that were used to hold down the animal for Shechita. Keep walking, you walk into a smaller structure that is called the Heichal. The Heichal is the structure which housed the menorah, the Shulchan, the Mizbeach HaKetores. Keep walking, you would hit the Parochas. You would hit the curtain which divided between the Heichal, the Kodesh, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Go behind that curtain, and ultimately, again, you would see the Aron HaKodesh, Aron HaBris. So as I say, now watch this. The Gemara wants to suggest that the Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim is based on where they learn their dimensions for a Pesach, for an entranceway from. Watch this. Says the Gemara, Disnan, Pischo Shal Heichal, the entranceway of the Heichal, Gav ha'esrim amma v'rach ba'esr amma. So we'll say the Heichal, which you can remember is the smaller structure which housed again Aron, menorah, shulchan, mizbeach. So the entranceway of the Heichal, Gav ha'esrim amma, was 20 amas high, v'rach ba'esr amas, and 10 amos wide. V'shal ulam, Gav ha'arboim amma, v'rach ba'esrim amas. And ultimately, again, the ulam on the other hand was 40 amos tall and had a width of 20 amos. So we'll say ushneim mikra echad darshu, and both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan both darshu in the same pasuk. What's the pasuk? V'shachatu Pesach Oel Moed. So we'll say the pasuk says they shall shecht the carbon. They shall shecht the carbon at the entranceway of the Oel Moed. So we'll say, now watch this. The shaila is, the Torah is telling us that at this entranceway, this is called a Pesach. Remember again, the Machlokas Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama in the Mishnah, and the Rabbanan in the Mishnah, is what is the definition of a Pesach? What is the definition of an entranceway? The Rabbanan are saying an entranceway has a maximum height of 20 amos and a maximum width of 10 amos. The Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says no. An entranceway has a maximum height above 20 amos. Now, if he has a cap on that, we'll have to see. And Lamai says, sounds like he agrees to the same width obligation. So watch this. So the Gemara says, Rabbanan sabri kedushas heichal lechud kedushas ulam lechud v'chi ksiv pesach olamoy the heichal ksiv. The Rabbanan holder will say that the kedusha of the heichal and the kedusha of the ulam are two different kedushos. And when the pasuk says that you shecht karbanos pesach oel moed, The Pesach that is being referred to over here is what? Is the entranceway of the Heichal. So you see from here that the Torah describes the entranceway to the Heichal as a Pesach. Therefore, the entranceway of the Heichal becomes our paradigmatic Pesach. And what are the dimensions of the entranceway of the Heichal? What are the dimensions? 20 amos in height, 10 amos in width. Beautiful. So therefore the Rabbanon say, therefore when it comes to Hilchos Eruvin, when it comes to Hilchos Mavui, so if you want to place a Korah to create an entranceway for your Mavui, no problem. The Korah just has to be within 10 amos, within 20 amos of height, and the width cannot be any more than 10 amos. Rabbi Yehuda holds, Rabbi Yehuda Savar, Heichal v'ulam Kedusha achasi. Rabbi Yehuda holds that really the Heichal and the Ulam both have one Kedusha. And technically speaking, if you wanted to shech the carbon, you could shech the carbon by the entranceway of the Heichal or the entranceway of the Ulam. If that's the case, according to Rabbi Yehuda, the dimensions of the Ulam also satisfy the criteria for the definition of Pesach. And what are the dimensions of the Ulam? Rabbi say, what are the dimensions? 40 amos in height by 20 amos in width. Therefore, Rabbi Yehuda will say, even if the Korah is above 20 amos, totally fine. To which the Gemara says, by saying, well, the other possibility is the Rabbi Yehuda nami kedushas ulam lachud kedushas heichal lachud. Then maybe Rabbi Yehuda holds that the kedusha of the ulam and the kedusha of the heichal are really separate and distinct. So what is Rabbi Yehuda's logic? Why does he allow for a Korah above 20 amos? Why is that? So the Gemara says, Tichsiv el Pesach ulam habayis. Because Rabbi say ultimately again, because the Torah itself uses a lashon of Pesach Ulam Habayis. So you see over here that the entrance of the Ulam is called a real Pesach. To which the Gemara says, Rabbanan, Ihava Kasiv al Pesach Ulam Kidika Amrit. Hasam Hashta Dichsiv al Pesach Ulam Habayis. It's Habayis Hapasuach Li Ulam. So let's say, it's a incredible machlokes how to dash in the pasuk. Rabbi Yehuda understands Pesach Ulam Habayis is teaching me that the entranceway of the Ulam, which again is 40 by 20, satisfies the criteria of a Pesach, and therefore again, even if the Korah is above 20 amos, totally good to go. The Rabbanan have a dramatic drasha. They say a Pesach Ulam Habayis means the entranceway that opens up to the Ulam. It's not actually a reference to the Ulam entrance, rather what is it a reference to? The Heichal entrance, which is 20 by 10. Vaha ki ksiv hai b'mishkan ksiv. So I'll say, but one second, let's just analyze this. All of these psukim are talking about the Mishkan. Right? Remember, the psukim that we're quoting over here are by the Mishkan. So how do we know? Remember, and what are we doing? We'll say, so we're quoting psukim. Remember, the pasuk that we quoted before, ultimately of Vishachat oso Pesach or Moed, that's by the Mishkan. Yet we're going ahead and we're gleaning dimensions of the Pesach from the Mikdash. So how do you do this? So the Gemara says as follows. The Gemara says, V'al kiksiv hai b'mishkan ksiv ashkechan mishkan de'ikri mikdash u'mikdash de'ikri mishkan. That's not our problem. I'll tell you why. Because the truth is, we use the terms Mishkan and Mikdash interchangeably. And whatever applies to one applies to the other. Dilo teimachi, because if you don't say this, Hadam Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, Shlamim sheshachtan kodem psichas delasos ha'eichal psulin. But this is actually very interesting. If you shecht your shlamim early in the morning, before the doors of the Mishkan are open, ultimately the shlamim are psulim. So you need to go, as Rashi points out, shlamim sheshachtan, third to last line in Rashi, shachris kodem psichas delasas heichal psulim. If you shecht your shlamim before you open the doors of the Beis HaMikdash in the morning, ultimately again the shlamim will be pasul. Shnei amar v'shachatu pesach oal moed, because the pasuk says you shall shecht it by the entrance of the oal moed. Bizman shepsuchin v'lo bizman shein neulin. You can only shecht the shlamim when? When the doors are open, not when they're closed. But one second. Vaha ki ksiv ahi b'mishkan ksiv. Rabbi will say that pasuk of v'shachatu pesach oal moed is by the Mishkan. And guess what? Rabbi will say, what didn't the Mishkan have? What did the Mishkan have? Doors. The Mishkan didn't have doors. So what are you doing? You're learning out a concept of the Beis HaMikdash, that you can only shech the shlamim once the doors are open from a pasuk in the Mishkan. So you see from here on both sides that Mishkan, Mikdash are interchangeable. Ella, Ashkechan, Mikdash, De'ikri Mishkan, Mishkan Dekri Mikdash. So therefore you must say that we find that the Mikdash is called the Mishkan is called the Mikdash, and that allows us to use the psukim in the Torah mentioned in the context of the Mishkan to even learn out halachos by the Beis HaMikdash. So Bishlam Mikdash Dekri Mishkan, so I understand, or I know that the Mikdash is called the Mishkan. Where do I know that from? Dichsiv, V'nasati es Mishkani b'sochachem, because the pasuk says, I will place Mishkani, my dwelling place, within you. And that pasuk is obviously a reference to the Beis HaMikdash. Ela Mishkan, the Ikri Mikdash Milana. But where do I know that the Mikdash? So now I know that the Mikdash is called the Mishkan. But where do I know that the Mishkan is called the Mikdash? Ilema midichsev v'nosu hakasim nosei hamikdash ve'kimu as hamishkan ad bo'am. So maybe you'll say, because the pasuk says the Kahasites, right? The Kahasim, people from the family of Kahas, would carry the Mikdash and they would erect the Mishkan. So we'll say, so maybe you see from here that the Mishkan is called the Mikdash. Amud Beis, that can't be it. Why? Hahu ba'aron ksiv. Because we'll say that pasuk actually in this context when it says nosei hamikdash, Mikdash over here is actually a reference to the Aron. It's actually a reference to the ark which Bnei Kahas carried. Ela mehacha, rather we'll say it's from a very simple place. The Gemara says, Ela mehacha, va'asu li mikdash, v'shachanti b'socham. The pasuk says, make for me a mikdash and I will dwell within you, which of course again is the beginning of Parashas Truma, which is a reference not to the Beis HaMikdash, but instead a reference to the Mishkan. So therefore I will say, halacha l'maisa, we see that the Mikdash could be called the Mishkan could be called the Mikdash. So I will say, so remember, let's take a step back. So far what we have over here is as follows. We're trying to understand what is at the root of the Machlokes Rabbi Huda and the Rabbanan. Namely again, the Rabbanan saying the Korah, right? The beam across the top of the Mavui must be within 20 amas. The Rabbi Huda is saying no, it could even be above 20 amas. So where we're holding right now is we are assuming that they have a fundamental machlokes as to the definition of a Pesach. What is the definition of an entranceway? So each of them glean their definition from two different places. The Rabbanan glean their definition from the entranceway of the Heichal. The entranceway of the Heichal is 20 by 10. Therefore, again, that's the definition of a Pesach. The point of the Korah, it appears, the point of the Korah is to create an entranceway or an exit for the Mavui, and therefore the Korah must be within 20 amas. The Rabbanan agree, yes, it has to be an entranceway. They learn their definition from what? From the Ulam. And the Ulam was 40 by 20. Hence, they hold that even a Korah that is above 20 amas will be 100% fine. So we'll say, let's analyze. So, Bein Rabbanan, Bein Rabbi Yehuda, Leilfu mi Pesach Shara Chotzer. So this is very interesting. So both according to the Rabbanan Rabbi Yehuda, let me give you, so we'll say, there's another entranceway, by the way. The other entranceway is the entranceway to the courtyard. To the courtyard. So if you take a look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi says, Leilfu mi Pesach Shara Chotzer, Arochav Parich, Disnam Masnisim, Barachav Be'eser Amosim Mait, Ha'ashkechon Pesach Chotzer Dahavi Esrim, Rochav Ve'ikri Pesach. So we'll say, so Rashi's understanding over here that actually the discussion is now transitioning to width. To width. Even though, again, remember, the Machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan would seemingly not just be about height. Because remember, again, if halacha l'maisa, Rabbi Yehuda is learning out his height dimensions from the Ulam, which is 40 amas, so the Pashtos he would be learning his width dimensions from the Ulam as well. What are the width dimensions of the Ulam? The width dimensions are 20 amas in width. So again, we'll see what we do with that in just a moment. So the Gemara says, Leilfu mi Pesach Shara Chotzer. Dichsiv, Orach HaChotzer Mea Ba'ama. Right, the length of the Chotzer ultimately was 100 amas. The Rachav Chamishim Bechamishim. The width was 50 amas. Vikoma Chamish Amos. And I will say the height of the wall or of the entrance of the Chotzer, the curtains of the Chotzer, was 5 amos. It was 5 amos. Uksiv. V'chamesh esrei amos kilayim l'kasef. Now I will say, when you walked into the Chotzer of the Mishkan, so the Chotzer of the Mishkan had curtains that were 15 amas tall. 15 amas tall. Uksiv. V'l'kasef hashenis mizel l'shara Chotzer kilayim chamesh esrei amos. Ma lahalon chamesh barochav esrim. Afkan chamesh barochav esrim. So both say, why don't I say the same thing over here? Why don't I say that just like by the entrance of the Chotzer, there were 5 amos of height and 20 amos of width. So you had an entranceway that was 5 by 20 5 amos of height, 20 amos of width. Why don't you say the same thing over and over? Why are we only focusing ultimately again on the ulam and the heichal? There's another entranceway as well. Entranceway to the courtyard of the Mishkan, which was 5 by 20, to which the Gemara says, very simple, Pesach shar hachotzer ikri, Pesach stama lo ikri. Both say this is very profound. Because again, we're looking for a biblical paradigm. What is the biblical paradigm of a Pesach, of an entranceway? The problem over here is that by the entranceway of the Mishkan, there's too many additional modifiers. It calls it Pesach Shar HaChotzer. HaChotzer. So it calls it an entranceway to a Chotzer. We're not looking for an entranceway to a Chotzer. What are we looking for? What are we looking for? A Pesach. Or a Pesach Shar. Just an opening. So the interesting thing is that both by the Ulam as well as by the Heichal, the Lashon ultimately again is just Pesach. It's just Pesach. Pesach Oel Moed, right? That's the Shiloh. What does Pesach Oel Moed refer to? Pesach Shar HaChotzer. There's an additional modifier there. That modifier makes it too unique, too specific, and therefore cannot be used as the paradigm. The other possibility is Ki ksiv kilayim chamesha se'ama l'kasef gegolfa hu dichsiv. So we'll say ultimately again when it speaks about the curtains of being 15 amos high. So I'm sorry, when it speaks about the curtains being 15 amos, that's 15 amos in height. So but 1 second. V'aksiv the koma chamesh amos. We'll say, but now we have a contradiction because one pasuk says that, or one place indicates that the height of the curtains was 15 amos, which sounds like the height of the entranceway to the Mishkan was 15 amos. But then in another place it says 5 amos. So we'll say it's not a contradiction. Hahu misvas mizbeach ulamayla. Suppose it's very interesting. From the ground to the top of the curtains was 15 amos, but from the top ledge of the mizbeach to the top of the curtain was 5 amos. Okay, just two different ways of measuring. So we'll say, but the point over here is, although we have another set of dimensions by the entranceway to the courtyard of the Mishkan, we do not want to use that. Why? Because Lashon HaPasuk gives me Pesach Shar HaChatzer. Fine. Rabbi Yehuda. So we'll say, so now again, so we're still back to where we were, which is what? The Rabbanan learn out their dimensions for a Pesach from where? From where? Pesach HaHeichal. Heichal was 20 by 10. The Rabbanan Rabbi Yehuda on the other hand seemingly learns out his dimensions from where? Ulam. Ulam was 40 by 20. Okay, that's what we're holding right now. To which now the Gemara questions that. Rabbi Yehuda, mipischo shel ulam gamar. Is that true that Rabbi Yehuda learned out his shita from the entranceway of the ulam? V'hatnan, but we learned v'harachav me'esra amos yimait v'lo palig Rabbi Yehuda. But I say, here's the problem, and we knew this was coming. Remember again, you're going to tell me that Rabbi Yehuda learns out his dimensions of an entranceway from where? From the ulam. The ulam again was what? What were the dimensions of the ulam? Dimensions? 40 by 20. 40 by 20. Here's the problem. The second part of the Mishnah said that if you have an entranceway of a mavui that is more than 10 amos, what do you have to do? You might diminish it. And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue on that. See, remember again, Rabbi Yehuda argues in the first part of the Mishnah, right? When it says, Mavui shu lamala shu gavola esrim amma, yemai. Tanakama says, bring down the Korah. Rabbi Yehuda says, you don't have to. Then it says, V'harachov me'esr amos, and if your entranceway is more than 10 amos wide, you got to lessen it. You have to narrow it. And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue. But I don't understand. Rabbi Yehuda should argue on that as well. Because the same way Rabbi Yehuda holds that a Korah that's lamala me'esrim is good out of the heichal. Remember again, Rabbi Yehuda should hold that even if the entranceway is much more than 10, even up to 20 amos, it should be totally fine. Yet Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue. So why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue when it comes to the width of the entranceway? V'atinan, v'arachav me'esr amos yimai v'lo palig Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi, no, don't worry, palig bebraisa. So Rabbi says Rabbi Yehuda does argue. He just already lodged his argument in a brisa, and therefore didn't feel the need to restate the argument in the Mishnah. Where does Rabbi Yehuda argue in a brisa? Watch this. This sanya, v'harachav miyud amos yemait. Suppose we have another brisa that says that if you have a mavui that is more than 10 amos wide, you should diminish the width of the mavui. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eno Sarich Lamait. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you don't have to diminish it. So we'll say, here it is, on record. Rabbi Yehuda argues in the Brisa. Says, since Rabbi Yehuda argues in the Brisa, he didn't feel the need to lodge the argument in the Mishnah. So Gemara says, I don't understand. V'liflog b'mas nisin. So So we'll say, but I don't understand, well, how is that an answer? How is that an answer? Meaning, first of all, this is a brisa versus a mishnah. We'll say a mishnah is always considered to be more powerful than a brisa. So if Rabbi Yehuda is going to launch his argument anywhere, it should be in the mishnah, not in the brisa. To which the Gemara says, you're right, palig begofha v'hu din l'rachba. So we'll say, interestingly enough, the Gemara assumes that we understand that really Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on both. So once the Mishnah stated his argument by the height, it's almost inferred that he is arguing by the width as well. So even though the Mishnah doesn't state explicitly that Rabbi Yehuda argues on the width, it's almost understood intuitively that he argues. Which I want to say makes sense, because once we're saying that the machlokes comes down to how you define the paradigmatic Pesach. Is the paradigmatic the Pesach the Heichal or the Ulam? So it's understood that Rabbi Yehuda, just like he argues on the height, also argues on the width. But still, are you sure that Rabbi Yehuda learns out his paradigmatic dimensions of an opening from the Ulam? Vatanya, we learned, Mavui Shugavo Mechaf Amo Yimait. If you have a mavui that is taller than 20 amos, so again, you should diminish the height of the Korah. Rabbi Yehuda machshir ad mem v'nun amma. Rabbi Yehuda says, we'll say, listen to this fascinating verbiage. Rabbi Yehuda says, now, even if the Korah is 40 or 50 amos tall, I will say, now in general, whenever you see a statement like this, it drives us crazy. Why? Because halacha is all about precision. I mean, 40 or 50. What does that mean? 40 or which one is it? And if it's 50, 50 obviously includes 40. So we'll see. Rabbi Yehuda says even until 40 or 50 amos. V'tani bar kafra ad mea. Now we'll say bar kafra is not a third opinion. Bar kafra is explaining Rabbi Yehuda. Bar kafra says that really according to Rabbi Yehuda, even up to 100 amos would be totally fine. So we'll say, so what's happening over here? So we'll say, so look what just happened. So we have a brisa that really goes ahead and espouses two shitas, but there's a machlokes in the second shita, right? First shita is the shita of the Rabbanan. So we understand it. Korah must be within 20 amos. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no, it can even be 40, 50. Bar Kafra says, no, Rabbi Yehuda really holds it. It can even be up to 100. And I will say, so Rashi points out over here, V'tani bar Kafra b'milsei Rabbi Yehuda ad mea amma. So Bishon the bar Kafra guzma. So I understand. Bar Kafra is hyperbolic, right? That's hyperbole. 100 doesn't mean 100. What's 100 amos is a very tall. So that's a bit hyperbolic. El Rabbi Yehuda, my guzma. But we'll say, Rabbi Yehuda Shita, he said 40 or 50. Is that hyperbolic as well? Bishlam Rabbi Yehuda, arba'im garim pischol shel ulam. So what we'll say, if Rabbi Yehuda says that the Korah could be up to 40 amos, that makes perfect sense. Where does 40 come from? We'll say, where does 40 come from? Where does 40 come from? That's the ulam. The ulam is 40 amos tall. The Gemara says, Elonun minale. But we'll say, ultimately, again, where does 50 amos come from? So the Gemara says, Hamas nisai ati isei l'Rav. So we'll say, ultimately, again, Rav got a little thrown off by a Mishnah. This sanya, by a Bryce, this sanya, Mavri shugavoa michaf ama yosem ipischo shal heichal yemait. So ultimately, again, if you have a mavui that is taller than 20 amos, which is taller than the entranceway of the heichal. Rashi says, first of all, look at Rashi, ati isei l'Rav, damala Rabbi Yehuda lo lam da'alani pesach shul ulam. So we'll say, remember again, Rav is the one who introduced us to this idea that Rabbi Yehuda's shita is gleaned from by understanding that the Pesach of the Ulam is the paradigmatic Pesach. That's Rav. So Rav came to this through a little bit of a mistaken notion. Because what did the Brisa say? Here we go. Who savar midrabanan mipischo shal heichal gamri, Rabbi Yehuda mipischo shal ulam gamar, velohi, Rabbi Yehuda mipischa dimelachin gamar. Wow. So we'll say, watch this. Watch this. So you see, I will say, in the Brisa, so this Brisa is explicit. The Brisa says, if you have a Korah that is more than 20 amos tall, you must go ahead and bring it in within 20, just like the entranceway of the Heichal. Which tells us what I will say, that the sheet of the Rabbanan is explicit. Where do the Rabbanan glean their dimensions for a Pesach from? For a Rabbanan, what's the paradigmatic entranceway? The opening of the Heichal, which is, I will say, what? A 20 by 10 opening. That becomes the definition of a Pesach. Rav assumed that if the Rabbanan are gleaning their dimensions of a Pesach from the Heichal, then Rabbi Yehuda, who allows for a Korah to be above 20 amas, must glean his dimensions from where? From where? From the Ulam. From the Ulam. But in fact, Rav was wrong. Rabbi Yehuda does not glean his dimensions from the Ulam, but rather, again, he gleans his dimensions from the entranceway of royal palaces. Literally, again, mi pischa de malachim. Look at Rashi, pischa de malachim, stam pischi malachim, givon harbe. Let's say the entranceway to palaces are very tall. How tall? How tall? Interestingly enough, that's what Rabbi Yehuda, that's what I'll say now makes sense. What did Rabbi Yehuda say before? Like 40 or 50 amas. So in other words, it is a little bit of an imprecise shear. Because what it means, it just means it can be very tall. Because ultimately, again, you see that palaces make very tall palatial openings. So you see that a very tall opening is called the Pesach also. How much? Like 40 or 50 amas. And that's like, Bar Kafra says even 100 amas. So we'll say it would appear that Rabbi Yehuda is not so makbid on the height. I will say this also makes sense why, because now according to this approach, we would also understand that why doesn't he argue when it comes to the width? Why doesn't he argue? Because it's quite possible that he agrees. His only disagreement is by height, but by width he would agree that, yeah, 10 amas, even by malachim, even by kings, you don't really have entranceways that span endlessly. Therefore, he would agree ultimately, again, that by the width of it would be 10 amas. So we'll say, it turns out that there is a fundamental machlokes over here as to where Rabbi Yehuda is gleaning his shita. It appears everyone agrees that halacha l'maisa, the shita of the Rabbanan, is gleaned from the Heichal. The Heichal becomes the paradigmatic Pesach, the paradigmatic opening, which is a 20 by 10 opening, which are the shiurim reflected in the Mishnah. Therefore, a mavui must have its korah within 20 amas, and an entrance could be no more than 10 amas. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Where does Rabbi Yehuda glean his shita from? Well, Rav said he gleaned his shita ultimately from the Ulam, which is a 40 by 20 entranceway. 40 by 20 entranceway. So we'll say, so again, why doesn't he argue then on the Sefer of the Mishnah? So we go through that. Therefore, the way the Gemara ends off by saying is that no, Rabbi Yehuda does not glean his shita from the entranceway of the Heichal, of the Ulam, Rather, he gleans it from what the Gemara calls Pischa de Malachim, the entranceway of kings. And monarchical entranceways or palatial entranceways are often very high, but still the same 10 amas, and that's why Rabbi Yehuda is machshir with the Korah, even if it's above 20 amas. So we'll say, well, we're not finished. We'll stop over here at this. We'll say, I just want to make a suggestion. Now that we're beginning a new Masechta, as you know, because you're all veteran Daf Yomi people, part of the hardest thing of Daf Yomi is the pace in which we learn and the ability to retain. It's kedai to begin a process of chazara. You don't have to review the whole Daf every day, because that's a big commitment. If you review one amud, do one amud a night. I will say, you could time yourself. Give yourself 10 minutes. 10 minutes, so that way, you don't get scared, it doesn't turn into hours of learning. I will say 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, a person could chazer a daf very quickly, and ultimately, again, just reinforce and review that information. If you do this, it's an incredible way to be kona the Masechta. That way, again, halacha l'maisa, a person doesn't just breeze through Gemaras, not remembering one amid a day, ultimately, again, allows you to retain the information. Shkach, I will say.